Hi again, we're back for part 2 discussing the philosophy of Ergo Proxy. Now, in the previous episode, I discussed the distinction between mind and body, illustrated this problem by covering two different arguments from the meditations that illustrate such a distinction, and then discussed a fair amount of the monadology. We have seen how important Cartesianism is to understanding the show, just as Cartesianism is integral to understanding modern philosophy to this day. One thing I mentioned briefly and would like to reiterate is that Descartes works hard in the meditations to establish the union between the mind and body, just about as hard as he works to establish their distinction. There is nothing my own nature teaches me more vividly than that I have a body, and that when I am hungry or thirsty, the body needs food and drink. Or again, I am not merely present in my body as a sailor in a ship, but I am very closely joined and as it were intermingled with it, so that I and the body form a unit. And that's quoted from Cottingham, 1998. And this explicit union between the mind and body is going to be important in this part because our main goal is to establish a psychoanalysis of the machine. If anything, the cogito virus corrupts the mind of the machine in such a way as to make the body and mind dependent on each other to function. It is a blurring of the lines between application and body so as to produce a unique soul akin to that of humans. So, one of the things I forgot to talk about briefly in the previous episode was Descartes' conception of God and why his conception of God is compatible with Leibniz. So, just real fast, Leibniz and Descartes are not compatible on a number of things, including motion, but the reason I claim they are compatible in terms of God is because of something mentioned by Descartes in part 2 of the Discourse on the Method, which carries on from the quote about architecture. Likewise, it is quite certain that the state of the true religion, whose ordinances were made by God alone, must be incomparably better ordered than all the others. And later, in a letter to Marsin, he makes clear that God created all truths and all essences and has the power even to change whatever he wants. The mathematical truths which you call eternal have been laid down by God and depend on him entirely no less than the rest of his creatures. Indeed, to say that these truths are independent of God is to talk of him as if he were Jupiter or Saturn and to subject him to the Styx and the Fates. Please do not hesitate to assert and proclaim everywhere that it is God who has laid down these laws in nature just as a king lays down laws in his kingdom. There is no single one that we cannot understand if our minds turn to consider it. They are all inborn in our minds just as a king would imprint his laws on the hearts of all his subjects if he had enough power to do so. It will be said that if God had established these truths, he could change them as a king changes his laws. To this, the answer is yes, he can if his will can change. But I understand them to be eternal and unchangeable. But his will is free. Yes, but his power is incomprehensible. In general, we can assert that God can do everything that we can comprehend, but not that he cannot do what we cannot comprehend. It would be rash to think that our imagination reaches as far as his power. The difference of this to Leibniz's conception is that Leibniz thinks that God did not so much create everything as he did choose everything. And I think that these two conceptions, while very different, are compatible because while God cannot change his mind about what the actual world is like, it is because God lacks a reason to change it. What actually exists is nothing more than mental blueprints. Possible worlds correspond to divine thought complexes, ideational structures in the mind of God. The actual world maintains these blueprints as nothing more than merely possible structures, but nevertheless they exist as possible structures. So, with that clarified, let's move on. Like I said, we're going to be covering every philosopher or psychoanalyst mentioned in Ergo Proxy in this episode. Husserl, Berkeley, Lacan, Kristeva, Deleuze, and Guattari. And we're also going to be covering people who were not mentioned, such as Levi-Strauss and Saussure, because they're important for understanding those who are mentioned. Freud is also one of these characters. And we're going to see how these different individuals' thoughts are built upon the foundation of Leibniz and Descartes. So let's start out by addressing a statement I made in the previous episode and what I meant by it. I said, quote, I use the example of Deleuze and Guattari because I think that while they play a role, their inclusion is limited because they rather serve as a clue in piecing together a psychoanalysis, not so much that they are integral to understanding the picture, but rather that they give the picture greater nuance as we work on interpreting all the scholarly voices that shape the anime. And I still maintain that elements of Deleuze and Guattari were cherry-picked because I believe that is true for all of the philosophers and psychoanalysts that we're going to discuss today, but this makes it sound like I'm downplaying their role, and I was at first. The reason for this being is that I think Deleuze and Guattari function like a bow on a present. They are often used as a bridge for understanding how the different pieces fit, and in this way, they're much more flexible than, say, Berkeley is when we're looking at his contribution to the mix. So initially, I had it backwards, thinking of the bow as less important than the present itself, but then unwrapping a present is sometimes much more exciting than the present itself. If you want to think of it like a pyramid with Descartes and Leibniz on the bottom and Deleuze and Guattari on the top, that is probably sufficient, but then it remains to be seen where our other players fall on the hierarchy. Anti Oedipus gives us a framework for understanding life in the domes. The people of Ramdo live carefree consumerist lives, oblivious to life outside the dome. They exhibit a desire to be led. The masses desire their own oppression. And we see this well exemplified in the character of Vincent Law, who appears to have uprooted himself from the status of proxy, attempting to become one of Ramdo's fellow citizens. Vincent is desperate to become one of the many, or so he believes. Anti Oedipus gives us the toolkit for understanding Vincent's motives. As Foucault puts it, Anti Oedipus is a rejection of fascism and everything it stands for. Being anti Oedipal has become a lifestyle, a way of thinking and living. In short, a rejection of the kind of life led by the citizens of Ramdo, who go along quietly and willingly follow the remnants of the previous human civilization. We must remember that these humans are not the real ones, but rather serve as artificial replacements carrying on human tradition while the domes wait for mankind's return. Much like the schizophrenic, only when Vincent is forced in an extreme moment to give up his naive dream of becoming a citizen can he discover or remember who he truly is. Which is Ergo Proxy, a new god built by Ramdo's original proxy to survive the return of humans. Because obviously, this entire situation is incredibly unfair to the proxies, the autoreeves, even the artificial humans who live out their lives in ignorance of their roles. As Seam puts it in the introduction of Anti Oedipus, Oedipus is the figure of power as such, just as neuroses is the result of power on individuals. Oedipus is everywhere, robbing us of power, teaching us to desire our own repression. Everywhere it is machines, real ones, not figurative ones, machines driving other machines. Ergo Proxy is the rejection of this, the active product or creation of one god, Proxy 1, refusing to yield to fate. And Monad, meeting Ergo Proxy in mosque, acknowledges Ergo Proxy's pain. She thus grants him the opportunity to become the human Vincent Law, consequently rejecting her own fate too. As we will come to see, she falls into a coma later in Ramdo. So, what is the present then, tied up with a beautiful anti Oedipal bow? We recognized previously the importance of the monadology, illustrating the very atoms of this futuristic world. We also recognized the importance of dualism, the mind body question. Now we acknowledge that it all boils down to a body without organs, a desiring machine that is fueled cyclically by other machines, a huge undulating life force that enables its own existence. So, where do these other philosophers come in? Like I said previously, it's important to establish a psychoanalysis of the machine, which Deleuze and Guattari do. But they are but one approach to the psychoanalytic question. Both Lacan and Kristeva contribute to the completion of a diagnostic and treatment. So, what does Berkeley and Husserl have to do with anything? I believe that their contribution is tied up with Derrida, and so what they contribute is a phenomenology as well as an understanding of language and how language contributes to a societal structure, and thus contributes to Deleuze and Guattari's desiring machine, because language itself is a kind of prison. Where I want to start is with Berkeley, because he is the oldest philosopher following Descartes. We're going to do this mostly chronologically, though I have already covered Deleuze and Guattari. Berkeley was a bishop, Bishop of Cloyne, and he derived most of his philosophical inspiration from the work of Locke. Indirectly, he was incredibly inspired by Descartes because of Descartes' role in Locke's work, to the point where Kant claimed, without naming names, that there were two forms of idealism, dogmatic and skeptical, and these two forms are interpreted to be espoused by Berkeley and Descartes. Berkeley believes that the world contains nothing but spirits and ideas. He argued that one cannot have abstract ideas insofar as when we picture something in mind, that idea is shaped by particular observations or experiences. Quote, As it is impossible for me to see or feel anything without an actual sensation of that thing, so is it impossible for me to conceive in my thoughts any sensible thing or object distinct from the sensation or perception of it. Consequently, there is no such thing as an abstract idea. Berkeley's main question, his fundamental reason for writing, is the question of existence. What is existence? What is it all about? Berkeley's first answer is rather consistent with Descartes because it is esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived. If everything which confronts us is an idea, then the principle of existence must be found in the nature of ideas. It is absurd, however, to think of ideas as existing outside the mind. And to exist in a mind is to be existing outside the mind. Hence, nothing can exist which is not perceived by that mind. And that's from Scruton 2005. To quote from a thesis I found examining their connection, Descartes' I think therefore I am is compatible with Berkeley's to be is to be perceived. Descartes, proceeding from the point of view of a mathematical physicist, reduced matter to mere extension, a purely quantitative determination. Berkeley, on the other hand, who was a psychologist and not a physicist, started from the actual data of consciousness, i.e., sense qualities. Both, however, arrive at the same fundamental worldview, the reduction of the material world to the status of a mode of mental activity, mind alone being able to maintain itself as substance. Hence results in both thinkers an emphasis on the wall so that both are, in the last analysis, voluntarists. In terms of ergo proxy, the question is why, if Berkeley is so compatible with Descartes, Berkeley is accepted as a guiding philosopher and Descartes is not. Descartes' cogito corrupts the minds of autoreivs and grants them sentience, while Berkeley's esse est percipi does not. I think the reasoning here has to do with Berkeley's general reception as a philosopher, as well as just how fundamental Descartes was or is to other philosophers' philosophies. His original work was criticized harshly and mostly written off as flawed and incorrect. After all, Berkeley requires that things cannot exist unless they are perceived. I think the point in making Berkeley a philosophic voice on the part of the local government of Ramdo is specifically because he was wrong. I think his role in government is to help characterize the panel as a group of decrepit philosophers with skewed thinking, who, in their echo chamber, no matter how intelligent they are, fall short of the mark. As Rawl, chief of security, tells the panel, we've been working in ignorance from the very start. Rawl feels as though he can no longer protect Ramdo, for Ramdo itself has become a kind of prison. And he says this right before telling the regent to go to hell. So while Berkeley is an important voice in philosophy, very few people take him seriously, and I think that was part of the point the writers of Ergo Proxy were trying to make. So the next guy on our list is Freud. Freud's importance in the anime is measurable by his attachment to multiple other figures who are named, but he is perhaps key to discovering how to interpret the story. Freud was basically the founder of psychoanalysis, i.e., the founder of the system we now know as therapy, those one-on-one sessions you have every month or so with your therapist. He also came up with the Oedipus complex, which obviously has some bearing in this anime because of the presence of Deleuze and Guattari. That's where they get this idea from for capitalism and schizophrenia. The Oedipus complex is named after a Greek tragedy called Oedipus Rex, where a man accidentally falls in love with his mother and kills his father. Freud also came up with a structural model of the psyche, which was composed of what he called the id, ego, and superego. He also believed that humans commonly performed what he called slips, which gives us insight into an individual's thought processes and beliefs. Where I think Freud is important, however, when it comes to ergo proxy, is with his work regarding dreams. Dreams for Freud are seemingly senseless, but nevertheless possess deeper meaning. To quote Freud, if we transfer our conception from a single element to the entire dream, we find that the dream as a whole is a distorted substitute for something else, something unconscious. And to quote Wilson, sleep is a kind of withdrawal from the external world, characterized by a turning away from both physical and social reality, a boundless egoism. During sleep, the everyday norms of civilized behavior are challenged by atavistic impulses of greater or lesser degree, unacceptable desires that are alien to the individual's value system. This is not a specifically Freudian idea. As long ago as 380 BC, Plato observed in the Republic, in sleep, the wild beast in us, full fed with meat or drink, becomes rampant and shakes off sleep to go in quest of what will gratify its own instincts. In fantasy, it will not shrink from intercourse with a mother or anyone else, man, god, or brute, or from forbidden food or any deed of blood. Yet Freud insists that dreams are above all the guardians of sleep, that somehow detoxify disturbing stimuli and render them anodyne. Explicitly bad dreams and sexual dreams clearly represent an exception to this formula and may wake a person, but according to Freud, this is a failure in their primary function. Normal dreams and everyday errors, he goes on to argue, serve as a model for the puzzling symptoms of neurotic illness, which are also to be understood as the product of conflict and compromise. In this way, he creates a bridge between general human psychology and mental pathology. For Freud, the key to unlocking the hidden meaning of a dream, both his own and those of others, was the technique of free association. Somewhere inside themselves, dreamers knew the underlying triggers, but did not know that they knew. By following a chain of what, on the face of it, were random thoughts associated with the dream material, the dreamer would reveal its latent content. The associations were free of conscious control, but highly determined by unconscious psychic activity. But not all material in a dream yields to the free associative method, and so Freud had a literal list of symbols that could help with the translation of various things that might occur in a dream, such as the number 3. So you can see how Freud might be important when we're talking about a story that is specifically designed with dreams in mind, as we made clear in part 1. We can imagine that this technique of free association is meant to be used throughout the anime to understand what Vincent is going through. One problem, though. We don't know what to look for, especially on a first run, and neither do the characters. Everyone is in the process of discovering at the same time, even if some are further along than others. The audience specifically is discovering everything through a kind of liminal space. We can't help Riel or Vincent. This drives home the recognition that this is an anime that was supposed to be rewatched over and over again in developing a sort of analysis in order to help invent a psychoanalytic framework. Answers can only be found through repetition, the goal being to discover this unconscious thing. Freud also gives us a framework of 3 rules to go by when interpreting dreams, and so this can and should be used when trying to interpret the anime. 1. What the dream seems to say, whether it be sensible or absurd, clear or confused, is not our concern, since it can under no condition be that unconscious content we are seeking. 2. The awakening of substitute formations for each element shall be the sole object of our work. 3. We shall wait until the hidden unconscious we are seeking appears of itself, as the missing word Monaco in the experiment which we have described. Now, this last rule is really interesting and is useful when talking about Gustave and Lacan, but what Freud thinks is happening is that the mind naturally skips over the object of significance so that the patient builds a story around the thing they don't want to face. To quote Freud again, we understand that the task of interpreting dreams is carried on against a certain resistance which manifests itself by these critical objections. This resistance is independent of the theoretical conviction of the dreamer. Even more is apparent. We discover that such a critical objection is never justified. On the contrary, those ideas which we are so anxious to suppress prove without exception to be the most important, the most decisive, in the search for the unconscious. There is a distinction in what is happening, termed as the manifest content of the dream, which is that which the dream relates, and latent dream thoughts, which is that which is hidden, which we can only reach by the analysis of ideas. As you can imagine, there are many ways in which these two things can be connected. Let's look momentarily at episode 14, titled Ophelia, where Vincent, Pino, and Riel all encounter another proxy, one that tries to trick and deceive them in order to kill them. This accidentally manufactures a kind of dream, one where the only character who can see through it is Pino because she is an autoreeve. The proxy copies both Riel and Vincent, echoing them to try and figure out who it can copy in order to gain love from one or the other, or perhaps Pino. This is an episode which heavily digs into symbolism and also avoids telling us exactly what is happening until Vincent confronts the doppelganger proxy, just as the patient requires the help of the psychoanalyst in order to speak. We come to find that what this proxy is seeking is an escape from eternal solitude, unable to be anything but a proxy that copies. It destroyed its citizens in an attempt to find love. I found if I pretended to be someone else, I could be loved. But after a while, I realized that the person they loved wasn't me. I am no one. Therefore, I am loved by no one. And so I decided to end myself. But even if we want to end ourselves, we can't. So we ended the others. For in them we found reflections of ourselves. The proxy, able to see itself as equal in Vincent, is able to discuss the problem freely in the landlocked water of a lake, which is symbolic, of course. Nothing gets in or out, and the fixed water reveals one's reflection clearly. As Riel narrates starting out the episode, "Mirror, mirror on the wall," a phrase from an old familiar tale beckons us to the fountain of illusions, the face of someone who looks like you, reflected on the surface of a wavering mirror. The dream in this instance is the perpetual farce in which the doppelganger proxy lives. The details that hide its existence are obviously built into its existence, and we see those details in the way it plays with Riel and Vincent's forms. The doppelganger proxy thus plays with the manifest content of the dream and latent dream thoughts as it interacts with Riel and Vincent as a tactic to understand them in order to manipulate them. Only can it start to come out of its dream when faced with another proxy, someone it can relate to more easily. Meanwhile, the dream for Vincent is the life he lives as a human. The parameters of his existence are less obvious and thus must be seen through at least an additional lens. What do we do with a walking, waking dream in which one eats, shits, and sleeps as a second being? A dream experience which is in fact undistorted. How do we access this experience? Well, that's where everyone else comes in. So let's first turn to Husserl. Husserl is a difficult figure to talk about, primarily because he wrote so much throughout his lifetime, so we're only going to touch on a few features of his work, enough to give you a sense of what kinds of things he was talking about. The first thing you need to know is that Husserl is considered the founding father of phenomenology and influenced thinkers such as Heidegger, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty, even though phenomenology existed before Husserl, just in a different way. Husserl is consequently responsible for the development of existentialism, and we can even see in Ergo Proxy how that factors in, as Vincent Law seems to become a flaneur type of character as he goes on his search for meaning. As Ricoeur put it, all of phenomenology is not Husserl, even though he is more or less its center. Phenomenology has a past which situates it within the history of Occidental philosophy and connects it with the Leibnizian and Kantian sense of phenomenon. Although Husserl is connected to these philosophers, he diverges from them in a number of distinct ways. Most importantly, Husserl's version of phenomenology is characterized by his understanding of phenomena as distinct from other philosophers, such as Hegel or Kant. Husserl believes that the phenomena of phenomenology, that is, objects of perception, are experienced as they truly are. That is, he thinks that phenomena, when experienced, appear to us in their true form. Of second most importance is the fact that Husserl is a fan of Descartes. The greatness of Descartes, for Husserl, to quote Ricoeur, lies in his having produced the project of a philosophy which is at the same time a science and the ground of all sciences within the system of one universal science. By rights, the cogito is the transcendental subject. This idea of the transcendental subject stems from Kant, for Husserl is what is known as a neo-Kantian. He unifies the cogito and the transcendental subject in a way because he thinks that the transcendental ego explains experience better, the ego taking the place of the cogito in "I think therefore I am." But to quote Ricoeur again, phenomenology is still more radically related to Descartes to the Cartesian doubt and cogito. The reduction which it effects from false evidences, from what is self-understood or a matter of course to the true phenomenon, to the genuine appearing, is quite in line with the Cartesian doubt. But in Husserl, the cogito becomes something other than a first truth upon which other truths should follow in a chain of reasons. The cogito is the only field of phenomenological truth, and within it all claims to sense are brought before the presences which make up the phenomenon of the world. Thus, phenomenology continues the transcendental of Kant, the originary of Hume, and the doubt and cogito of Descartes, and so Husserl gets to his beliefs through his assimilation of prior philosophers theorizing about human experience. To reference one of the Wheaton lectures I listed in my bibliography, Husserl thinks that naturalistic philosophy has basically damaged our understanding of experience. Beginning with Descartes, people like Nietzsche and Wilhelm Dilthey have established up until this point the notion that our understandings of knowledge and truth and phenomenological experience are all rooted in temporary experiences. Dilthey, for example, classified 3 different worldviews, each of which he attributed to some aspect of human psychology. There was the rational, the value orientated, and the empirically concerned. So basically, people who use logic, and then people who are more focused on lived experience, and then people who use science to observe the world. And the individual tends to participate in all of these types of observations at some point, but often settles on a type that they tend to use the most. What Dilthey is writing, he is working within the same time frame as Husserl, gives Husserl grounds for seeking new foundations for foundationalism, which refers to philosophy that seeks a theory of knowledge resting upon an observational, justified belief, or some secure foundation of certainty, such as a conclusion inferred from a basis of sound premises. And that's from Wikipedia. Descartes is the most famous foundationalist, and so that's why we end up here, with Husserl calling his own phenomenology Neo-Cartesianism. Descartes argues that one's belief in himself and other things and people is sufficient for knowing about the world, and Husserl thinks, alternately, that there is some sort of universal foundation that exists apart from these other psychological explanations for knowledge and experience. And this is where we get Husserl typifying his philosophy as transcendental idealism. By 1907, Husserl was seeking a radical critique of cognition which would uncover the conditions for the possibility of objectivity, to quote Stapleton, leading us to what is called the transcendental epoch in his philosophy, which essentially involves a more pure way of perceiving because we have rid consciousness of preconceived notions and additional judgments by a technique known as bracketing. For Husserl, every intentional experience is an experience of a specific type, i.e., an experience of hoping, desiring, regretting, affirming, doubting, wondering, fearing, etc. And each of these experiences is characterized by being of or about or directed at an object in a particular and distinctive way. A central task was to analyze these differences in detail, to map out the way they are systematically interrelated, and more generally to inquire into and investigate how objects can appear to us in the way they do and with the meaning they have. For Husserl, intentionality is a distinctive feature of our experiential life, although he also allows for a subset of non-intentional sensations such as pain or dizziness. It is a feature that is inherent to the conscious states in question. It is an integral part of their being and is not one they only come to possess in virtue of being influenced by an external cause. As Husserl would formulate it in later text, the specific experience of this house, this body, of a world as such, is and remains, however, according to its own essential content, and thus inseparably experience of this house, this body, this world. This is so for every mode of consciousness which is directed towards an object. It is, after all, quite impossible to describe an intentional experience, even if illusionary, an invalid judgment, or the like, without at the same time describing the object of that consciousness as such. And that's from Zavi 2025. So you can see here that he's already talking about description of an intentional experience. Husserl is showing that he is concerned with experience as it is translated through perception and consequently language, and so intentionality is conceived in primarily linguistic terms. To characterize it further, quoting Ricoeur again, from the start, Husserl confers on the notion of intentionality its full breadth. Every consciousness is a consciousness of ... And in parentheses, I have here, consciousness signifies not the individual unity of a flux of subjective processes, but rather each distinct cogitatio turned towards a distinct cogitatium. Cogitatio is an articulation of Husserl's view of different types of thinking, such as perceiving, imagining, willing, etc. And then follows from this cogitatio the subject of this cogitatio. And these are different from his conceptions of the noema and the noetic, which are concepts whose meanings are still in contention, and so I'm not going to talk about them. Hence, there will be as many species of intentionality, as many consciousnesses, as there are ways in which a cogito may be turned towards something. For example, towards the actual, the inactual, the past, the willed, the loved, the desired, the judged, and so on. From a purely descriptive point of view, intentionality avoids the alternatives of realism and idealism. Insofar as it appears to a consciousness, one can say that the object transcends that consciousness, and likewise that the object is in that consciousness. But it is there specifically by virtue of being intentional and not by virtue of being a really inherent part of consciousness. Intentionality only signifies that consciousness is, in the first place, outside of itself, and that it is so in manifold ways, among which logical objectivity is only a modality of the second degree, and perception is the most fundamental modality. It should also be noted that this intentional object we're talking about originates with Franz Brentano. So this characterizes Husserl's theory, though he diverges from Brentano insofar as he rejects a dualistic representationalist, mentalistic doctrine of intentionality. To quote Olafson, from the beginning, Husserl understood intentionality in terms of the object referring or objectifying function of mental acts, and he made the crucially important distinction between two senses of intentional object, namely between the object that is intended and object as it is intended. Intentionality under Husserl becomes the basic vehicle of objective reference and thus our knowledge of the world. So, perception, obviously for Husserl, requires an intentional act in order to experience veridically. It is, Husserl writes, evident that with the presentation of pine tree, I intend precisely a pine tree, a tree of a kind determined by this or that trait, and not a cockchafer or something else. And that's quoted from Semino 2022. This, of course, creates problems when we're trying to determine the difference between veridical perception, illusion, and hallucination, but we're not going to go into that. Husserl also thinks that there is more to intentionality within the intentional experience, which is the distinction between the matter and the quality of the intentional experience. He calls both of these things the matter of the act and the quality of the act, and neither exists independently of one another, much like how meaning and intentionality go hand in hand for Husserl. Act qualities can be combined with different act matters to produce some kind of intentional thing that we mean to say or think. To quote Zavi 2025, as long as we focus on our ability to mean something, we can make do with the quality matter dyad, or with what Husserl also calls the intentional essence. And this, of course, can change with the way we choose to describe things. Husserl is also concerned with the primacy of speech as an action or act. Recall that an act, properly understood, is an intentional experience. He is not concerned with the written word, and he is not concerned with motor movements. We saw this in an earlier quote from Ricoeur regarding signification. To Husserl, it's just the spoken word that matters. But an individual's internal monologue also counts as a speech act. Quote, the thesis of ideality of meanings is meant to rescue us from that privacy and to situate the thinking subject in the communicative world. Intentional acts, as experiences, to quote Olafson again, are anchored in time and in the life history of self. Their central function is semantic and referential in nature, which in turn characterizes the speech act. But Husserl thinks that the word expression should be identified with the word speech, and that meaning, as an understanding of anything, is an ideal entity. And in this way, it is inaccessible except by the subject who thinks using words or speaks openly. The final thing we have to cover as regards Husserl is his thing with signification. We see him start to talk about this in the first part of the logical investigations. Husserl's interest in signification is tied up with intentionality, which in turn gets tied into perception and subsequently language, and all of this is wrapped up in his attempts to debunk Descartes, which characterizes a lot of what we see later in Heidegger and Sartre, because this is where they get this idea from. Keep in mind that Saussure was born in 1857, so he's born right around the same time as Husserl, which means that people are talking about this notion of signification at the same time that Husserl is working on this. Husserl does change his mind on this idea later in his work, but it's important because it helps us understand how meaning works in his philosophy. His conception of signification is tied up in his eventual rejection of logical psychologism, namely the notion that the logician obtains evidence for the truths he teaches from psychological questions about various statements, such as what kind of person was making the statements. And that's from an essay by Dallas Willard from Elliston and Cormack. To quote Atwell, one of Husserl's primary concerns in the first investigation is to distinguish the signification of an expression or statement from those features of expressions which are frequently, but in his view erroneously, regarded as significations. And he thinks this is the fault of psychologism. For Husserl, quoting Ricoeur again, the empty act of signifying is nothing other than intentionality. The first act of the individual consciousness is to designate meaning, which is what being intentional about objects in the world is about. Signifying thus contains the essence of intentionality. The intentional object also need not exist except in the mind or eminently. It need not exist at all in order to be referred to. Husserl's view of consciousness is that it is always directed at something. There is no such thing as pure consciousness. All consciousnesses are conscious of something. And so the intentional object only existing inside the mind allows for consciousness to keep existing even when it is not directing itself outward. To quote Husserl, to use an expression with sense and to refer expressively to an object to present the object are one and the same. It does not matter at all whether the object exists, whether it is fictional or even impossible. He emphasizes the subject object dichotomy of the cogito ergo sum and manipulates this to his advantage. Additionally important here is Husserl's division of existence into two realms, which he calls the ideal realm and the real realm. The real is characterized by temporality. Everything in the real occurs in time. The ideal, meanwhile, includes all significations as well as species, universals, consists of non temporal or timeless entities. There is a distinction between real mental acts and ideal significations. When I utter a statement, the act of experiencing the statement is a fleeting experience. But what is said is an ideal existent. It is a signification of the statement, meaning that it is the content of the experience. Signification is about the multiple actual and possible acts of expressing a particular signification. Now, I want you to keep all this in mind, but put Husserl off to the side for a moment because we're going to circle back around when we talk about Derrida. The next person on our list is Lacan. Lacan is existing during a time period in France of revolutionary thought when it comes to so many different disciplines, particularly art, as I covered in our existentialism episode. But he has as his predecessors both Saussure and Freud, and he does something incredibly interesting with their ideas. So, what is Lacan doing with these ideas? Lacan, first of all, takes Freud seriously when it comes to the idea that the mind avoids the subject it most wants to focus on. And secondly, Lacan looks at the structure of psychoanalysis itself in terms of defining what happens to a particular person or subject. Here's what I mean. In searching for the Freudian unconscious, we find the basis of psychoanalysis. He discounts the work of psychologists in this way, claiming that their insistence on the unity of the subject is the primary reason they fail. Lacan believes that everyone is a divided subject, and he shows this through a series of graphs. So Lacan comes up with these four different graphs portraying and examining psychoanalysis as a discipline, first of all, and second of all, explaining the human condition. Quote, it was constructed and perfected quite explicitly in order to map out on its different levels the most broadly practical structure of the data of analytic experience. And additionally, it will serve here to show where desire is situated in relation to a subject on the basis of his articulation by the signifier. As I explained earlier, Saussure invented this idea about the signified signifier relationship in language. Lacan departs from Saussure in a number of key ways to the point where they really aren't like each other at all. In fact, he critiques Saussure's famous tree diagram by comparing it to the ladies and gentlemen plaques over two identical bathroom doors, but he does think that the language of the signified signifier works, not just for language, but as a way to describe relationships in space and time, and he justifies this with reference to Freud. The work that Freud does leads Lacan to believe that the unconscious is structured like language, and thus we come to the conclusion that culture and language mirror each other at all times, shaping human behavior, and we are locked into culture from the moment we're born. Signification and a given culture's methods of signification shape who we become later in life. That's the main takeaway. Lacan believes that language is defined by the way that various signs, signifiers, take on value from their relation to one another, which produces a symbolic order. Signifiers are fragments of language, such as words or phrases. Language is thus composed of self-contained units of meaning because a sign is defined through other signs. Signifiers exist only in relation to other signs. And when Lacan proposes a definition of the signifier, he gives a circular definition. A signifier represents a subject for another signifier, and the subject is nothing more than the effect of the combination of signifiers. And that's from Miller, 1991. This creates what is called the symbolic register, which in Lacan's most simple diagram is represented by the delta symbol and which is shown to skyrocket through the signifier signified to meet the divided subject, which is on its same level. The elements are positioned in such a way as to show the divided subject is changed from the very beginning to the symbolic. To quote Lacan, and the subject, while he may appear to be the slave of language, is still more the slave of a discourse in the universal movement of which his place is already inscribed at his birth, if only in the form of his proper name. This is how we get the key statement: the signifier represents the subject for another signifier, meaning that the subject is stuck perpetually between the sign and that which is signified. But there's also something else happening here. Lacan is saying that the unconscious is entirely separate from consciousness. And here's where he starts to sound like Husserl. Lacan thinks that there is a difference between the subject and the thing that the subject is doing, but he also thinks that a subject is both saying something while also negating it. The example given in the Lacan online video I've referenced and which you should go watch is I am lying. The subject is saying, I am lying, but at the level of the unconscious, he is telling the truth. The unconscious subject emerges from the language being used. So, in a way, Lacan is doing something similar to Levi Strauss, who believes that language has the capacity to corrupt pure civilizations, and does so upon its very introduction. Both thinkers think of language as something that almost lives and breathes and has the capacity to affect those who witness it. Quote, the subject not insofar as it produces discourse, but insofar as it is produced fate, cornered even by discourse. But he is also unintentionally echoing Husserl when he says that language changes when it is uttered. Quote, the presence of the unconscious, being situated in the locus of the other, can be found in every discourse in its enunciation. Lacan continues in the same line when he says, here, no doubt, things are my signs, but, I repeat, signs of my speech. If Cleopatra's nose changed the world's course, it was because it entered the world's discourse. For in order to change it for the longer or the shorter, it was sufficient, but it was also necessary that it be a speaking nose. Speech in Ergo Proxy is important because it is carefully constructed to lead the viewer. In the episode I mentioned titled Ophelia, there are real moments of silence that help build a sense of trepidation. And later in episode 15, where Riel, Pino, and Vincent are stuck playing a strange game show, words are used to tell the background story of Ramdo and the other cities. Most interestingly, the missing word games echo Lacan and Freud by taking away an integral signifier and then rewarding it when Vincent gets the answer wrong. It is like dangling a carrot before a horse, repeatedly pulling away every time it goes to bite, but eventually allowing the horse to eat the carrot only when the holder decides. Through a game of spoken signification, we and the characters all learn more about the world in which they live, fleshing out the story even as meaning appears to break down. As Vincent learns more about the world and himself, the less he seems to know. And with that, let's turn to Derrida. Jacques Derrida is known as the founder of deconstruction, a philosophical project that was illustrated in 3 different texts: Voice and Phenomenon, Of Grammatology, and Writing and Difference. Today, I'm mostly only going to talk about the first of these texts, Voice and Phenomenon, because Derrida directly addresses Husserl primarily in it, and I think that's what makes it most important for our purposes. It also clearly represents Derrida's germinal structure of thought, which makes it an excellent introduction to his work. To quote Stephen Boos, Derrida's critique of Husserlian phenomenology is necessary for understanding Derrida's own contribution to the history of thinking, because it is by working through phenomenology that Derrida sought to overcome it and in the process develop a new way of thinking known as deconstruction. But what is deconstruction? In order to talk about deconstruction, we have to talk about 2 people we've already mentioned, Saussure and Levi-Strauss. Let's start with Saussure, who we've already cursorily covered when talking about Lacan. Ferdinand de Saussure is the first person to establish a real linguistic method. He is the founder of modern linguistics, and he is what is known as a structuralist. He helps define structuralism as a movement. In the bibliography, you will see that I have linked a copy of his entire book called Course in General Linguistics, and if you want to read the section I am going to talk about, please start at page 65 and read until page 78. You can read more than that, but this is probably the most important part of this entire book. This is what Saussure is famous for. He came up with the idea that in language there is a difference between the written word and the idea of the written word. This is called the signifier and the signified. Saussure says that the linguistic sign unites not a thing and a name, but a concept and a sound image. The latter is not the material sound, a purely physical thing, but the psychological imprint of the sound, the impression that it makes on our senses. The sound image is sensory, and if I happen to call it material, it is only in that sense and by way of opposing it to the other term of the association, the concept, which is generally more abstract. Saussure is saying that language is impactful because we have learned to associate sounds and arbitrary signs, such as letters, with particular things in the world. The idea of things, the things we see in front of us and have the ability to remember and twist into new ideas. These are communicated to us using arbitrary signifiers, and thus they become that which is signified. So, this is what people like Kristeva mean when they say that language is arbitrary. To continue, the linguistic sign is then a two-sided psychological entity that can be represented by the drawing of a circle divided in half. Concept is written in the top half and sound image is written in the bottom half of the circle, with vertical arrows going both ways, the tree diagram, as I mentioned before. The two elements are intimately united and each recalls the other. There is also a difference between a sign and a symbol. The symbol of the scales for justice, for example, could not just be replaced by the symbol of a chariot. Symbols are non-empty, which means that they do carry some inherent meaning. But words don't. And Saussure is the first person in Western history that we know of to have this idea that the written word doesn't have any real meaning. The meaning that it does have is created by us because we attach meaning to various sounds and letters. There is not meaning inherent to the language itself. Symbols, such as the drawing of a tree, are only different because they are an image of a real thing, or they represent something that appears to be real to us in some sort of visual sense. In terms of this revelation's contribution to structuralism, Saussure is asking us to consider culture as being a part of this larger language system, defined by the structure of language that Saussure has so kindly pointed out to us. Structuralism and later post-structuralism are movements that come to define deconstruction. Derrida actively critiques Saussure throughout his career, particularly in On Grammatology, suggesting that the notion of the signifier ought to be done away with, and he also suggests in another essay that structuralism is limited by its inability to talk about change. One of Saussure's contemporaries is named Levi-Strauss. He is also a structuralist. Levi-Strauss is an anthropologist who was very influential in the 50s and 60s in various disciplines, and he is directly reacting to and rejecting existentialism. Derrida's main gripe with Levi-Strauss actually has nothing to do with his theoretical work, but rather Levi-Strauss's autobiography titled Tristes Tropiques, 1955. This work is largely an anthropological study, as you might have already assumed. The most important part about this autobiography, though, is a chapter named The Writing Lesson. It is dedicated to a South American Indian tribe called the Nambikuara. In this section, Levi-Strauss details an encounter with the Nambikuara wherein he tries to teach the tribe how to write. After a few days, the tribe begins to imitate the way that the words are written by the ethnologist on paper in the horizontal format, but they do not improve beyond this. This is because they do not understand the function of writing. They don't need it and never have. The only experience they have with it is drawing, such as zigzag and dot patterns decorated on the shells of gourds. So to them, it's just squiggly lines on a page. The ethnologist recounts that when he is taken by the chief to other Nambikuara tribes, the other tribes are hostile to the presence of foreigners. To calm down the situation, the chief insists that they proceed with the customary exchange of gifts. The chief proceeds to take out the paper he was given and pretends to read out a list of gifts to be exchanged. The comedy, according to Levi Strauss, lasts for 2 hours. Taking from Levi Strauss, Derrida is constructing his own theory of writing. Derrida questions Levi Strauss's motives as well as his interpretations of events. Levi Strauss positions himself as the outside aggressor who pokes at the social structure of this civilization. Derrida thinks that there's far more going on. There are violences that have already occurred in civilization. That's why certain problems come up in the communication between foreigner and ethnologist. Levi Strauss wants the civilization to be pure, while Derrida thinks that they are not so innocent. To reference a different moment where the Nambigwara children are admonished for sharing their names with a foreigner, there was in fact a first violence to be named, to give names that it will on occasion be forbidden to pronounce, such as the originary violence of language which consists in inscribing within a difference, in classifying, in suspending the vocative absolute. To think the unique within the system, to inscribe it there, such as the gesture of the arch writing, arch violence, loss of the proper, of absolute proximity, of self presence, in truth, the loss of what has never taken place, of a self presence which has never been given but only dreamed of, and always already split, repeated, incapable of appearing to itself except in its own disappearance. Levi Strauss thinks, in essence, that exterior language is a corruptive archetype and enacts violence insofar as it exists and is used. This has a lot of connection to primitivism, the art movement. One example might be Gauguin. You might know him as a friend of Van Gogh. Anyway, I think the most important takeaway is that Derrida criticizes Levi Strauss and in so doing invents deconstruction. I think that Ergo Proxy is a project of deconstruction, and we see this through the characters as they battle their internal demons insofar as they gain agency. The cogito virus is the instigator, just as Descartes' work served as a turning point in philosophy. Descartes was medieval in his approach, but he also marked the start of what we consider modern thinking. What we are seeing is the psychoanalysis of Otto Reeves, but we are also witnessing a breakdown in meaning. As Jack Reynolds points out, the project of deconstruction contends that in any text there are inevitably points of equivocation and undecidability that betray any stable meaning that an author might seek to impose upon his or her text. The process of writing always reveals that which has been suppressed, covers over that which has been disclosed, and more generally breaches the very oppositions that are thought to sustain it. And as a result, we come to understand the experience that these characters are having. This is perhaps a reason why so much shit happens in this anime. The writers really did what they wanted with the material, and so a lot of it loses meaning just as a lot of it gains meaning, because that's exactly in line with what is happening when Derrida takes a stand against Levi Strauss. The anime itself is a work of deconstruction. There is nothing outside the text, states Derrida, suggesting in this case that there is nothing to be said of the anime that is not already stated through its own existence, or that which can be experienced each time one sits down to watch. As Professor Paul Fry illustrates in the Yale Courses video I referenced, Derrida's prose is a kind of evasive dance whereby one does not settle for distinct positions, for any sort of idea that can be understood as governed by a blanket term, what Derrida called the transcendental signified. Again, with the transcendental, Kantian of course, but we know that he gets this notion from Husserl. So Derrida writes in a way that is obfuscatory, moving around his argumentation to avoid deriving the argument from some definite concept, much like, I think, the writers of Ergo Proxy. Ergo Proxy avoids telling us directly what is happening, something which is particularly unique to anime, but also in itself purposeful. What Derrida has to say about deconstruction, then, is integral to understanding what the anime is trying to do, and even what it is not trying to do. Each viewing is unique in its own way, and so in those moments one finds themselves suspended in a temporary experience, perhaps intending towards the show, and in so doing, experiencing something new altogether. So with that, we can see how Derrida stands on the shoulders of Saussure and Levi Strauss, but what of Derrida's interpretation of Husserl? To Derrida, Husserl's phenomenology belongs to what he calls the metaphysics of presence, a metaphysics which he thinks characterizes the history of Western philosophy. As Derrida states, we would like to show here, therefore, that the movement in which the whole of phenomenology is already engaged repeats the original intention of metaphysics itself. Quoting Lawlor, in this history of Western philosophy, language, in particular the sign, are conceived as being derived from perception or thought, as if perception and thought were independent of the sign, as if the sign somehow supervened upon perception or thought as a kind of accident. Making the sign derivative opens the way for it to be conceived merely as a modification of presence or as merely relative to presence. This metaphysics is thus characterized by various centers or a centered idea, and at one point the foundationalism of Descartes. From the subjectivity of the statement cogito ergo sum, there is a desire to be present, thus characterizing this metaphysics of presence. The desire must be fulfilled. Quoting Lawlor again, this does not begin with Descartes, though it is palpable when considering his thought. Quote, presence has determined the meaning of being in the history of metaphysics since the ancient Greeks and right up to Husserl's phenomenology. Presence is defined as that which is available in front of my look. It is what is proximate, the content of an intuition. But the content of an intuition is changing and diverse, which means that presence must also be the permanence of a form or idea. Phenomenology conceives formal presence, ideality, as that which is to be lived. Derrida thinks that phenomenology maintains certain metaphysical prejudices and brings us to a point beyond phenomenology. This point beyond phenomenology is the moment preceding the decision that ushered in the metaphysics of presence. This is the moment of instability preceding the assurance of metaphysics, the moment of difference, or life understood as an ultra-transcendental concept, and that's from Boost 2008. And so Derrida's goal is to deconstruct Husserl's phenomenology by going through and beyond it, bringing us through the epoch to the ultra-transcendental. Derrida starts out by critiquing the first logical investigation because it concerns the sign as a means of access to the ideal meanings of logic. There is a problem with the sign, namely because there is ambiguity in how the sign works. Sometimes signs function to indicate a factual state of affairs, while at other times they function to express ideal meaning. Husserl attempts to untangle expression from indication and show that expression is better than indication insofar as it gives us access to ideal meanings. Quoting Derrida, indication is different from expression because it is, insofar as it is an indication, deprived of Bedeutung or Sinn, bedeutungslos, sinnlos. Husserl thinks he can find expression in its pure state in the internal monologue, when attempts to communicate have been suspended, which Derrida criticizes. To quote Boost 2008, according to Husserl, we can distinguish between two kinds of signs, expressions or indicative signs. Signs may be either expressive in the sense that they embody a meaning or intention in themselves, or they are indicative, in which case they are animated by a meaning extrinsic to themselves. It is the task of deconstruction, as Derrida practices it, to contaminate the Husserlian distinction between expression and indication by showing how they are inextricably connected and cannot be separated, as Husserl suggests in the first investigation. Important to Derrida is Husserl's Im selben Augenblick, literally his statement in the blink of an eye, regarding how acts are lived by us in an instant, where he determines that the living present appears to have a center which is the now point, which includes immediate memory, retention, which is different from regular memory, called secondary memory, and the anticipation, potention, of the now that is about to appear. Without getting in too deep, Derrida argues that there is continuity despite difference within duration. There is a process of differentiation wherein the retentional phase, wherein repetition occurs, such as the back and forth of dialogue, language is really the medium of this play of presence and absence, and an identity is fomented but never quite completed because it is always moving forward to infinity. Identity is always deferred, always a step beyond. This kind of movement is called difference and produces what is called the trace of retention, because this is what gets left behind by the identity which moves forward. Let us continue with the idea of deferral by infinity, Lawlor writes. The trace refers back to this absence, but it continues to come back and function. The trace really resembles a memory. Insofar as it continues to function as a memory does, it also resembles something written. And the trace repeatability carries on to infinity too, which carries with it ideality. Quote, ideality is the salvation or the mastery of presence in repetition. In its purity, this presence is the presence of nothing that exists in the world. It is in correlation with acts of repetition which are themselves ideal. This kind of trace comes prior to the voice. Any audible iteration is trumped by that which makes the movement possible. Even so, the element of signification, or the substance of expression, which seems best to preserve at one ideality and living presence in all of its forms, is living speech, the spirituality of the breath as phone. Traces can thus be audible as well, bleeding into the parts of the speech act. Derrida repeatedly says that the voice hears itself, given the proximity of the speech act. Quote, "My words are alive because they seem not to leave me, seem not to fall outside of me, outside of my breath, into a visible distance. They do not stop belonging to me to be at my disposal, without anything accessory." In this way, what he calls the phenomenological voice is given. For Derrida, the written signifier is fundamentally different from the voice, and yet voice still plays a role in the ideal written signifier. The phenomenological consciousness, voice, and an outside of the world exist in between the graphic depiction of the signifier and its empirical body. When it comes to the voice alone, however, there is nothing like this at play. As he writes, hearing oneself and seeing oneself are two orders of the self relation that are radically different. There is an apparent transcendence to the voice because of the immediacy of the signified expression. The body of the signifier appears to erase itself the moment it is produced. It is also absolutely close in proximity to the speaker. There is a livingness to the signifier which does not separate itself from language. Derrida thinks that the internalization of the spoken word helps make it ideal. Additionally, the ideality of the object appears to depend on the voice and becomes totally available in it. The phenomenon which has been the object of the voice now has a better opportunity to show itself. Quote, "The phoneme gives itself as the mastered ideality of the phenomenon." Strangely, however, despite the apparent supremacy of the voice, Derrida suppresses the voice. As Anne-Marie Johnson explains, Derrida's famed innovation known as différance maintains a difference from the word difference that can only be witnessed on the page. Différance relies on a trope of mute inscription. In one sense, this is entirely appropriate because Derrida, pairing the phone with the history of metaphysics, wants to get away from this tradition. At the same time, he affords the spoken word a livingness that outdoes the ideal signified. The spoken word, nevertheless, beats that which is written down. He gets this, of course, from Husserl, who contends that meaning is revealed in an instant, as mute speech is conflated with intellection, again, as Anne-Marie Johnson puts it. It is this schema which he thinks underpins the metaphysical tradition. There is a privilege of the voice being afforded which, again, he wants to do away with. And yet he acknowledges that the voice makes it possible for Husserl to differentiate between expression and indication because it is in fact the medium for the expression of ideal objects which can be repeated indefinitely and remain the same, and that's from Booth 2008. According to Derrida, Husserl maintains that meaning, a thought, is generated, quoting Lawlor, a stratum of silence, the absolute silence of the self-relation. The notion is that sense or reason must be present in the sense of an object and present in the sense of the subject. This sense is generated by hearing oneself speak by means of a particular self-experience of one's own thoughts. As one produces silent phonic forms, an exteriorization happens as the speech's temporality, spatiality across moments, makes these phonic forms ideal given the proximity of the experience. To quote Lawlor again, requiring the intervention of no surface in the world, the voice is a signifying substance that is absolutely available. Its transmission or iteration encounters no obstacles or limits. The signified, or what I want to say, seems to be so close to the signifier that the signifier seems to be diaphanous. But even so, as we mentioned before, the voice is repeatable to infinity, and so there is a potential distance to the words which allows them to refer to non-presence too. So what does this have to do with ergo proxy? In an article from 1998 titled The Typewriter Ribbon, Derrida proposes a question that is interesting for our purposes as it relates to this revelation we have encountered regarding the Speech Act. Will this be possible for us? Will we one day be able to, and in a single gesture, to join the thinking of the event to the thinking of the machine? Will we be able to think what is called thinking at one and the same time, both what is happening, we call that an event, and the calculable programming of an automatic repetition, we call that a machine? For that, it would be necessary in the future, but there will be no future except on this condition, to think both the event and the machine as two compatible or even indissociable concepts. Today, they appear to us to be antinomic. In the previous construction of the voice, we have seen two kinds of forces at work: event and repetition. For Derrida, event is the word he uses to refer to the force of a living being. Meanwhile, repetition is afforded to the machine. Quote, "It is destined, that is, to reproduce impassively, imperceptibly, without organ or organicity, the received commands. In a state of anesthesis, it would obey or command a calculable program without affect or auto-affection, like an indifferent automaton. And yet, repeatability is also happening for the human being. So these forces, while in a sense contradictory, are nevertheless inseparable. Derrida asks us to imagine the two becoming one within the automaton, wherein neither event nor the machine subordinates neither one to the other, neither does it reduce one to the other. This, in fact, seems to be happening with the cogito virus. Machines no longer simply follow their orders, but rather access the event of experience. Part of Derrida's significance, then, is giving us a vocabulary to navigate the difference between man and machine, as well as a vocabulary for when machine becomes like man. Now, this is a quiet anime, and so there is something to be said for how experience is taking place for various people, particularly those who are transitioning into the human experience. But the primacy of voice for us was to get to this point, where we realize the difference between the event and repetition and the way in which experience must be different for the machine. At the same time, we have found that the anime is a project of deconstruction, and perhaps this is why the anime attempts to tackle so many things at once. Now for our final philosopher slash psychoanalyst, Kristeva. What could she possibly have to add to this absolutely chaotic backdrop of players? The texts I consulted for this section were Powers of Horror and Black Sun, both written by Kristeva. Powers of Horror ended up being pretty much inconsequential for our purposes, and so I'm pretty much just going to talk about Black Sun. In Black Sun, Kristeva discusses the depressed and narcissistic subject, which I think is most important for us because of the state we find our machines in Ergo Proxy. Iggy is a prime example. In a way, Kristeva seems to address Husserl's subject-object dichotomy by suggesting that the depressed individual mourns not an object but rather a thing. And this is a theme in psychoanalysis. It is not dissimilar to Lacan's objet petit a, which I did not talk about in this episode because I thought Kristeva had a better handle on giving us a psychoanalysis of the machine than Lacan did. But Kristeva's has a unique sort of flavor that actually seems to possess plot significance to Ergo Proxy, and so we have to talk about it. This thing is described as the real that does not lend itself to signification, the center of attraction and repulsion, seat of the sexuality from which the object of desire will become separated. Of this, Nerval provides a dazzling metaphor that suggests an insistence without presence, a light without representation. The thing is an imagined sun, bright and black at the same time. It is a well-known fact that one never sees the sun in a dream, although one is often aware of some far brighter light. Obviously, Kristeva will continue to elaborate on this concept for the rest of the book, but this is where she first defines it, and we find significance in this for our purposes specifically because there is a depression in the Otto Reeves who have acquired consciousness, but also there's this dream aspect to the Black Sun. Suddenly, they must feel as humans do, for they have obtained a soul. So Kristeva's idea here is that the depressed person has this impression of being deprived of something unable to be represented, given the blackness of the sun, that is nevertheless good, it shines. The Otto Reeves affected with the cogito virus find themselves seeking something, and they see humanity as the thing that shines because humans appear to have the ability to find this effervescent purpose, and so they are depressed because they are innately unable to obtain such a thing. Additionally, the thing that Kristeva defines is archaic, a pre-object, and it introduces itself as a lacking that consequently desires metonymy. And metonymy, in this context, is a substitution of whatever it is one desires to fill this gaping hole. Although atheistic, those in despair are mystics, adhering to the pre-object, not believing in thou, but mute and steadfast devotees of their own inexpressible container. So there is irony here because that which is archaic in accord with the plot is the proxies themselves. No one knows quite how old they are, although they are at least 5,000 years old. There is a joke inherent to the name monad because of the original Greek meaning of the word. To refer to the etymology online dictionary entry on monad, the word derived from two Greek words, the first monas, which means unit, and the second monos, which means alone, which circles us back to the concept of a black sun, something like a gaping wound. From page 87, I had the impression that she had fitted in her psychic space one of those crypts Maria Torok and Nicholas Abraham talk about, in which there was nothing, but the whole depressive identity was organized around this nothingness. Such nothingness was an absolute, a nothingness that is neither repression nor simply the mark of affect, but condenses into a black hole, like invisible, crushing, cosmic antimatter, the sensory, sexual, fantasy-provoking ill-being of abandonments and disappointments. This hole becomes a home of sorts for the depressed narcissistic woman, just as others organize themselves around repression or splitting, and that's from page 88. And at first you think, oh, this is going to be almost totally Freudian, but then she moves into semiotics. What she's trying to do is suppose a theory of depression and melancholia using semiotics, and she believes that concatenation, which is a group of things that are linked in such a way that they lead to a particular result, and when she talks about it, she means it in a linguistic sense, i.e., the individual's speech is blocked and thus limited. It's a sign that an individual is experiencing melancholia. So obviously there are issues with this, but theoretically a psychologist would know the difference between, for example, a nonverbal autistic person versus a nonverbal depressed person, but she's not worried about that at all in addressing her theory. Kristeva is going to explain how she thinks this works biologically, which we're not going to get into because it's largely unnecessary for our purposes and difficult to understand, but then she's going to explain the much more interesting part of her theory. She believes that all of this is hierarchical. Just as language is ordered into series, the individual organizes his or her life according to their internal experience. From the analyst's point of view, the possibility of concatenating signifiers, words, or action appears to depend upon going through mourning for an archaic and indispensable object, and on the related emotions as well. Mourning for the thing, such a possibility comes out of transposing beyond loss and on an imaginary or symbolic level the imprints of an interchange with the other articulated according to a certain order. All of this is predicated on the notion that adults live in a world of representation. Quote, when that intrepid wanderer leaves the crib to meet the mother in the realm of representations. And because language is mere representation, it's arbitrary. Is not the signifier LAF completely unmotivated with respect to the meaning of laugh, and also, and above all, with respect to the act of laughing, its physical production, its intrapsychic and interreactional value? Signs are arbitrary because language starts with a negation, Verneinung, of loss, along with the depression occasioned by mourning. I have lost an essential object that happens to be, in the final analysis, my mother, is what the speaker seems to be saying. But no, I have found her again in signs, or rather, since I consent to lose her, I have not lost her. That is the negation. I can recover her in language, and that's from page 43. Depressed persons, Kristeva believes, cancel out this negation. They are unable to rediscover the other in language because they are afraid to lose the thing. Just as Iggy, and for that matter Daedalus, is afraid to lose Riel. She is the black sun for these depressed individuals, and for Iggy she represents a mother figure, which perhaps adds to Iggy's rage and subsequent choice to kidnap Riel and kill Vincent. To quote Kristeva, like an Alice in Distress Land, the depressed woman cannot put up with mirrors. Her image and that of others arouse within her wounded narcissism, violence, and the desire to kill. And that's from page 74. Daedalus goes so far as to create a new Riel, this time preserving Monad's memories within her, which is perhaps his attempt at what Kristeva says Alice in Distress Land does next, from which she protects herself by going through the looking glass and settling down in that other world where, by limitlessly spreading her constrained sorrow, she regains a hallucinated completeness. Again from page 74. So you can see how Kristeva is giving us additional vocabulary to unveil the world of corrupted machines. Kristeva sits down with the patient and interprets his or her sorrow, loss, and attempts to cope. Kristeva serves as the fundamental final piece of the puzzle, which is perhaps why she is a moving, thinking, acting character in the show. Kristeva, the auto Reeve, continues to do her work out of love and care even after corruption, just as the real Kristeva patiently tends to the plight of the depressed individual. And so we have seen how the work of Descartes, Leibniz, Berkeley, Saussure, Levi-Strauss, Freud, Husserl, Lacan, Derrida, Kristeva, Deleuze, and Guattari are woven together in this complex tapestry of inventing the machine that thinks like a human, feels like a human, and thus needs to be treated like a human. Ergo Proxy is a show that posits what if and gives us the tools to answer such a question hidden in plain sight. We see the machine suddenly adopt the mind body problem. Suddenly, human psychoanalysis applies to the machine. Thus, the machine is dragged, kicking and screaming, into discourse. While it's a slog to unravel the tapestry in order to discern its design, every piece is necessary for assembling the greater whole. To describe a tradition descended from Descartes, quite literally representing the way that the cogito took the philosophical world by storm. And at 32 pages for the second part, we are done. Thank you so much if you've made it through all this way. Ergo Proxy was a tough watch and a tough write for me, but it was still a journey I'm glad to have taken. And with that, I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving and did not get into too many fights with your family members. I will see you next time. Or I won't, because that's not how this works. Anyway, goodbye.